want you to just take a second and mentally put yourself in what could arguably be the lowest point of a person's life.
Right.
Like, picture the kind of rock bottom where the hits just keep coming and your nervous system is in the state of absolute overload. Imagine losing your mother suddenly. And then, in the immediate aftermath of that grief, your husband unexpectedly passes away.
I mean, that is just unimaginable.
It really is. And you spend years piecing your reality back together. You finally remarry, and almost immediately you find out your new father-in-law has terminal cancer.
Yeah, from a clinical perspective, that is the exact recipe for complex grief and, honestly, complete psychological collapse. The human brain is simply not wired to process that volume of existential threat without shutting down.
And shutting down would be the entirely expected, totally understandable response. But that was a reality for psychotherapist Amy Morin back in 2013. Instead of letting that compounding grief completely dictate her future, she sat down at her computer and wrote a letter to herself.
Which is such a fascinating pivot.
Right. It wasn't a diary entry about how unfair the universe was. It was this fiercely practical list of things she promised herself she would not do. That list went viral, reaching something like 50 million people, and eventually became the book, 13 Things Mentally Strong People Don't Do.
The sheer scale of that resonance tells us something really vital about modern psychology, I think. People are incredibly fatigued by standard self-help rhetoric.
Oh, absolutely.
When someone is in the trenches of real adversity, they don't want motivational quotes. They want an architectural blueprint for resilience. They want to know the mechanical steps to keep their mind from turning against them.
Which is exactly our mission today. We are pulling the absolute most critical, actionable insights from Morin's research to craft a practical guide specifically for you, the listener, to build personal development and resilience.
I love that.
But before we really get into the architecture of this, I want to give a very warm welcome to everyone tuning in as part of the Improve Your English Through Listening program. If you are using this deep dive to level up your language skills while exploring some fascinating human psychology, please make sure you become a member of the Speak Up English Hub channel.
Yeah, it really is the best way to support the show.
It is the absolute best way to support what we do and help the channel grow. Okay, let's unpack this.
So to build any kind of resilient architecture, we really have to examine the baseline of how you process daily friction. Because you cannot construct mental strength on a foundation of self-pity.
Right.
We have to look at the neurological mechanics of how we react when things go wrong, even in minor ways.
And the sources have this brilliant framing for this, using a completely mundane supermarket fender bender.
So the parking lot example, yes.
Yeah, so picture a crowded, stressful parking lot. 2 cars back out at the same time, bumpers crunch. It's minor, nobody is hurt. But Morin observes the 2 drivers, and they inhabit 2 entirely different psychological realities. Driver 1 gets out, does a quick assessment, and audibly exhales.
He's just genuinely relieved.
Exactly. He views the event through the lens of, wow, I am so lucky that wasn't a high-speed crash.
What's fascinating here is looking at driver 2. Because driver 2 gets out and immediately spirals. He throws his hands up, kicks the tire, and starts ranting about how life is constantly out to get him. Like, of course this happens today. I always have the worst luck. Why does this always happen to me?
They are looking at the exact same dented bumper, but driver 2 is actively choosing to suffer more.
Well, let's strip away the word choosing for a second and look at the underlying mechanism. Because self-pity isn't just a bad attitude. It is a highly destructive, self-reinforcing neural loop.
Wait, really? A neural loop?
Yeah, the human brain has a built-in negativity bias. We evolve to hyper-focus on threats to survive. But when you engage in self-pity, you are essentially hijacking that evolutionary mechanism and keeping it permanently switched on.
Oh.
You're training your reticular activating system, the filter in your brain that decides what information gets through, to actively seek out evidence that you are a victim. The more you verbalize your misery, the more dopamine you actually get from the familiar feeling of being wronged, and the deeper that neural pathway becomes.
It's like being stuck in quicksand. Like, the more you thrash around complaining about the quicksand, the deeper you sink into it.
That is a perfect analogy, yes.
So hold on, let me push back on this a little bit, because if we are talking about neurobiology, is the solution really just thinking positive? Because telling someone who is going through a real tragedy like Morin losing her entire family to just look on the bright side feels a bit dismissive.
Oh, totally.
It sort of crosses the line into toxic positivity, where we just pretend pain doesn't exist.
That is a phenomenal distinction, and it's one the sources are very careful to make. Toxic positivity is the denial of reality. It's saying the bumper isn't dented, everything is fine.
Right. Just ignoring the problem.
Exactly. What Morin advocates for is active gratitude as a neurochemical intervention.
Hmm.
You fully acknowledge the reality of the pain or the frustration, but you do not allow your brain to permanently camp out there.
So you interrupt the loop.
Yes, you force your prefrontal cortex, the logical reasoning part of your brain, to override the amygdala's threat response by actively identifying something positive.
Okay, so it's not about ignoring the dent. It's about actively forcing your brain to also acknowledge that, hey, your health is intact. But how does a person actually operationalize that? We hear, start a gratitude journal all the time. And frankly, it sounds a bit soft.
I know it sounds soft, but the clinical data behind it is incredibly robust. By physically writing down one specific thing you are grateful for each day, or forcing yourself to say it out loud to the people around you, you are demanding that your brain scan your environment for positive data.
Like saying, I am frustrated by this traffic, but I am grateful for the heating in this car.
Exactly. And if you do this consistently, neuroplasticity kicks in. The brain literally rewires itself. You weaken the default self-pity pathway and thicken the neural networks associated with emotional regulation.
So you eventually become driver one by default.
Precisely.
Okay, that makes sense. You're basically recalibrating the brain's internal threat radar. But here is the friction I see immediately. You can't dedicate energy to rewiring your internal state if your external environment is completely draining you.
Yes.
Which brings us to the next massive roadblock Morin identifies. To stop feeling sorry for yourself, you must stop giving away your power to other people. You have to establish healthy boundaries.
Boundary setting is usually treated as a buzzword, but it is actually the core regulatory system for your time and energy. If your daily life is entirely hijacked by other people's demands, your emotional bandwidth will inevitably collapse.
The sources highlight two very distinct archetypes here that I think anyone listening will instantly recognize. First, we have Lauren.
Oh, Lauren's situation is so common.
It really is. Lauren has this incredibly overbearing mother-in-law who operates with zero boundaries. She drops by unannounced, criticizes Lauren's cooking, critiques how she disciplines the kids, and Lauren does what society expects. She smiles, offers her coffee, and bites her tongue.
But internally, she is boiling.
Completely consumed by it. She spends her entire week trapped in anticipatory anxiety, just dreading the next knock at the door, venting to her husband, completely ruining her own peace.
And then the second archetype is the classic people pleaser.
Right, Megan. Megan is high-achieving but perpetually exhausted. Like if the church needs 36 muffins at the last minute, she bakes them. If her sister wants free babysitting on her only day off, she says yes.
Because she's terrified of conflict.
Exactly. She is so completely terrified of being perceived as unhelpful that she depletes herself to the point where she ends up snapping at her own family.
What links Lauren and Megan is a fundamental misunderstanding of emotional responsibility. High-achieving, intelligent people fall into this trap constantly.
Wow.
Well, they engage in these maladaptive behaviors, whether it's silently boiling like Lauren or frantic fawning like Megan, because they are trying to regulate their own nervous system by managing other people's reactions. They would rather suffer intense internal burnout than tolerate the temporary external discomfort of someone else being displeased with them.
It's like trying to keep your house perfectly clean while handing the neighbors a key to come dump their trash in your living room whenever they want.
That is brilliant. Yes, that's exactly what it is. And here's a hard truth for you, the listener, to swallow. It is not your job to manage other grown adults' negative emotions.
But wait, if Lauren finally snaps and sets hard rules, her mother-in-law is gonna explode. The family dynamic will become chaotic. How is replacing silent resentment with active family warfare actually protecting Lauren's peace?
Because it shifts the stress from unpredictable to predictable. Unpredictable stress, the constant dread of a knock at the door, destroys your baseline cortisol levels. It keeps you in a perpetual state of hyperarousal.
So setting the boundary isn't about changing the mother-in-law.
Right. Setting a boundary is not about controlling the mother-in-law's reaction. It's about Lauren taking ownership of her own territory. Sit down and establish firm rules, like we will invite you for dinner, but no dropping by unannounced and no criticizing.
Moving from being a victim of someone else's whims to being the architect of her own environment.
Exactly. And if the mother-in-law gets angry, that is her emotional burden to carry, not Lauren's.
That is a massive paradigm shift. You are not responsible for how another adult processes the word no.
You really aren't. And for the people pleasers like Megan, the intervention needs to be structural. When someone asks you for a favor, your brain's evolutionary threat response, the fear of social rejection, kicks in instantly.
So you say yes before you even think about it.
Right before your executive function can even calculate the cost of that commitment, you need to insert a cognitive buffer.
And Marin provides a literal script for this, which I think is pure gold. For Megan, or anyone listening who struggles with this, when asked for a favor, delay the yes by saying this exactly. Thanks for asking. Let me check my calendar and I'll get back to you in a bit.
That 10-second script is profoundly powerful. By delaying the commitment, you step away from the immediate social pressure. Once you are alone, the fear of rejection dissipates, and it is vastly easier to say no.
Okay, so we are establishing this firewall, we're stopping the self-pity loops, we're reclaiming our time and energy from overbearing people. Suddenly you have all this newly liberated bandwidth. And this is typically the exact moment people decide to make major life changes.
Oh yes, the big overhaul.
Right. But Marin points out a fascinating paradox here. This is also the exact moment we usually fail the hardest. But why do our best intentions usually fail?
Because having the energy to change and understanding the architecture of change are two vastly different things.
Let's look at Richard from the sources. Diagnosed with prediabetes and told he is 75 pounds overweight, Richard panics. He gets this massive wake-up call, throws out all his junk food, signs up for a premium gym, and pledges total health.
A complete 180 overnight.
Exactly. And the result, within weeks, he ended up snacking in front of the TV and didn't lose a single pound.
Which, neurologically speaking, was really the only logical outcome of that strategy.
But why? Because Richard's approach is exactly how society tells us to change. It's like trying to run a marathon when you've never even jogged a mile. Why do we always default to this massive all-or-nothing mindset when we want to change our lives?
This raises an important question about how we view motivation. We crave the dramatic leap because it provides an immediate massive hit of dopamine. Just the fantasy of the new you feels productive. But mentally strong people don't rely on radical shifts. They rely on daily habits.
Because the radical shift is too much for the brain.
Exactly. The brain is an energy conservation machine. When Richard tried to change his diet, his schedule, his physical exertion, and his sleeping habits all in a 24-hour window, he essentially spiked his allostatic load.
Allostatic load. Break that down for us.
It is the cumulative wear and tear on your biological systems from adapting to stress. By changing everything at once, Richard overwhelmed himself, which bred failure and ultimately mental weakness. He signaled to his amygdala that he was under a massive existential threat.
So his system just crashes.
Right. Mentally strong people understand this biological limitation. They rely on incremental, nearly invisible habits that bypass the brain's threat detection system entirely.
So what are the actionable steps for someone like Richard to succeed without triggering that system crash?
You have to break down the ambition. Richard needed to shift to aiming for just a 5-pound loss first, and then attach concrete actions to it. Make the change so small and unscary that shying away isn't an option.
Like what does that look like?
Start a food journal. Prep your lunch instead of eating out. Schedule exactly 3 gym visits a week, no more, and just take a short walk after dinner.
The bar is so low you can just step right over it.
Precisely. Because walking for 10 minutes doesn't trigger the amygdala's panic response, but it builds momentum.
Okay, so the architecture is really taking shape. You're setting healthy boundaries and incremental habits. But here is the final and possibly the most intimidating piece of the puzzle Maureen presents. None of this structure will stick if you fundamentally can't stand being alone with your own mind.
This is a huge issue today.
True resilience requires mastering solitude and internal self-talk. The sources introduce Vanessa, a highly successful real estate agent whose thoughts race endlessly at night because she never unplugs during the day.
Yeah. Society treats alone time as unproductive. We mask the silence with phones, background TV, constantly scrolling. But Vanessa is treating solitude as a void to be filled, rather than a necessary biological function.
What do you mean by a biological function?
Solitary skills directly correlate with increased well-being and better stress management. Think of solitude as the brain's processing cache. If you constantly mask input with external noise during the day, that data never gets processed.
So it hits you at 2 a.m. instead.
Exactly. The brain forces that processing window open the second the external noise stops.
But let me ask you this. What if your mind is a really negative place to be? What if sitting in silence just makes you dwell on all your past mistakes? The sources bring up Gloria, who was utterly paralyzed by guilt and negative self-talk over her past failures as a mother.
That is the danger of unguided solitude, and it's why people flee from it. When Gloria sits in silence, her brain defaults to the past because it is trying to solve a puzzle that cannot be solved. You can't change history.
So how does she endure the silence without spiraling into a pit of self-hatred? What are the actionable steps here?
First, you must accept the past and forgive yourself. And then, you use a technique called intentional redirection. When you catch your brain looping on past guilt, you actively force yourself to plan a future event.
Constructing the future.
Yes, like planning a vacation or mapping out a new goal. The brain can't easily dwell on the past when it's busy constructing the future. The cognitive load is just too heavy.
Okay, so the practical application for solitude is to schedule a literal date with yourself.
Exactly. It has to be dedicated time, no YouTube cat videos. Use this time for journaling or mindfulness. For Vanessa, implementing just 20 minutes of silent reflection completely cured her racing thoughts.
So what does this all mean? If we step back and synthesize this journey for the listener, the big takeaway is that resilience isn't a genetic lottery. It's an active practice constructed across three intertwined levels.
Right.
First, emotions stopping the self-pity loop with active gratitude. Second, behaviors using your newly protected energy for incremental change and healthy boundaries. And finally, thoughts finding peace in solitude and redirecting negative self-talk.
And as you build these habits, remember that perseverance beats natural talent. Thomas Edison is a great example of this. We all know his light bulb, but he also invented spectacular flops, like the ghost machine, to communicate with the dead.
Wait, really? A ghost machine?
Yes, complete commercial disasters. But he didn't see them as failures, just learning opportunities, just data points. Be compassionate with yourself as you build these habits.
View it as a data point. I love that. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to chew on. We spend so much time, money, and energy trying to figure out what new things we need to add to our lives to be happier and stronger. But what if the real secret to unlocking your ultimate potential isn't about what you need to start doing, but simply taking a hard look at what you need to stop doing?
Growth isn't always about addition.
Stripping away the excess to find the strength underneath. Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive. And a final warm reminder to the language learners tuning in. If you want to keep improving your English through listening, make sure you become a member of the Speak Up English Hub channel to support and help the channel grow. Keep guarding your energy, and we will catch you next time.